There are men who walk through history and leave footprints. And then there are men who change the shape of the ground itself. Abraham Lincoln was born into a world that did not expect much from him. A cabin made of logs. A fire that barely held back the cold. A father who could not read, and a mother who died too soon. But somewhere in that boy, in the flicker of firelight and the weight of silence, something stirred. A hunger not for comfort, but for understanding. A belief that words could be more powerful than fists, that a single life could bend the arc of a nation. He would become the man who held a breaking country together with nothing but will, wisdom, and an unshakable faith in what America could be. This is the story of how a poor boy from the wilderness became the president who ended slavery, preserved the Union, and died for the dream he fought to protect. Let his words carry you now, gently, into the quiet hours. If these words bring you peace as the night settles in, let this voice stay by your side. Subscribe softly, and let history walk with you into sleep. There are more stories waiting here, stories that calm the mind and stir the heart. Rest now, and know that tomorrow, we'll meet again in the glow of another life worth remembering. The winter of 1809 was bitter in the hills of Kentucky. Snow fell in heavy silence over Sinking Spring Farm, a place so remote that the nearest neighbor was miles away through dense forest. On February 12, in a cabin no bigger than a single room, Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to her second child. They named him Abraham, after his grandfather who had been killed by Native Americans decades before. The cabin had one door, one window, and a dirt floor. The walls were rough-hewn logs chinked with mud to keep the wind out, though the cold still found its way inside. There was a stone fireplace that smoked and crackled, a table made by hand, and a bed of corn husks and animal skins. This was where Abraham Lincoln's life began. Not in comfort. Not in promise. But in the kind of poverty that makes every day a test of will. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a man of hard hands and few words. He had worked as a carpenter and farmer all his life, moving from place to place, always searching for better land, always falling short. Thomas could not read or write. He signed his name with an X. He was not cruel, but he was distant, shaped by the harshness of frontier life. Nancy, Abraham's mother, was different. She was quiet and gentle, with dark hair and deep, thoughtful eyes. She told her children stories. She taught them kindness. And though she had little education herself, she understood the value of words. Abraham's older sister, Sarah, was his closest companion in those early years. Together, they played in the woods, helped with chores, and learned what it meant to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. The Kentucky wilderness was beautiful and unforgiving. Bears and wolves roamed the forests. Creeks swelled with rain and turned dangerous. Sickness moved through the hills like a shadow, claiming lives without warning. There were no doctors nearby, no schools, no churches. Families lived in isolation, dependent on their own strength and the occasional kindness of a passing neighbor. For young Abe, the world was small but vast. He learned to swing an axe before he could read a full sentence. He learned to plant corn, to mend fences, to hunt small game. His hands grew calloused. His body grew lean and strong. But even then, even in the midst of endless labor, something inside him reached beyond the trees. He wanted to know things. He wanted to understand how the world worked, why people spoke the way they did, what lay beyond the horizon. When Abraham was 7 years old, his family moved across the Ohio River into Indiana. Thomas Lincoln had lost his land in Kentucky due to a legal dispute over property titles, a common problem in a place where records were poorly kept and claims overlapped. They traveled north with all their possessions loaded onto a flatboat, then continued on foot through thick forest to a place called Little Pigeon Creek. There, Thomas began to clear land for a new farm. The work was backbreaking. Trees had to be felled, stumps pulled, brush burned. They built another cabin, this one slightly larger, but still simple and rough. Abraham, though still a boy, was expected to work like a man. He chopped wood until his arms ached. He plowed fields behind a horse. He built fences that stretched for miles. And at night, exhausted, he would sit by the fire and listen to his mother's voice as she told stories of faraway places, of right and wrong, of God and grace. But the wilderness took as much as it gave. In 1818, when Abraham was just 9 years old, a sickness swept through the region. It was called milk sickness, caused by cows eating white snakeroot, a poisonous plant that grew wild in the woods. Nancy Lincoln fell ill. She grew weak, feverish, unable to keep food down. There was nothing anyone could do. No medicine. No cure. She lay in bed for days, her breath growing shallower, her body failing. Abraham and Sarah sat by her side, helpless. Thomas stood in the doorway, silent. And then, on a quiet October morning, Nancy died. She was 34 years old. They buried her on a hillside near the cabin, in a grave marked by a wooden slab. Abraham carved her name into it himself. He did not cry, not then. But something inside him broke and reformed, harder and quieter than before. The months that followed were dark. Thomas Lincoln struggled to care for his children alone. The cabin grew cold and dirty. Meals were scarce. Sarah did her best to keep things together, but she was only 11. Abraham retreated into himself, spending long hours in the woods, thinking, grieving, trying to make sense of a world that could take a mother so suddenly. And then, a year later, Thomas traveled back to Kentucky and returned with a new wife. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. She brought warmth back into the cabin. She brought order, cleanliness, and something Abraham had not felt in a long time, hope. Sarah Bush Lincoln saw the boy's hunger for learning, and she encouraged it. She brought books into the house. She told him he was smart, that he could be more than a farmer. And for the first time, Abraham believed her. The books Sarah brought were few, but to Abraham they were treasures. There was the Bible, worn and heavy, filled with stories of prophets and kings. There was Aesop's Fables, with its lessons hidden in the voices of animals. There was the Pilgrim's Progress, a journey of faith and struggle that felt strangely familiar to a boy who had known little but hardship. And there was a spelling book, simple and plain, but it opened the door to language itself. Abraham read them all, over and over, until the words became part of him. He read by firelight when the day's work was done. He read by candlelight when everyone else had gone to sleep. He scratched letters into the ground with a stick. He wrote on the back of a wooden shovel with charcoal. Paper was too precious, too rare, so he made do with whatever surface he could find. School was not a regular part of his life. In the Indiana wilderness, schools were few and far between, often just a single room where a traveling teacher would stay for a few weeks before moving on. Abraham attended when he could, walking miles through the woods to reach the schoolhouse, but his total time in formal education amounted to less than a year. Still, he learned. He learned to read fluently, to write clearly, to do basic arithmetic. More importantly, he learned that education was not something that happened to you in a classroom. It was something you pursued on your own, relentlessly, hungrily, as if your life depended on it. And in a way, his did. Because without knowledge, without the ability to think and speak and argue, he would remain trapped in the life his father had lived, a life of endless labor, little progress, and no voice in the world beyond the farm. His father did not understand this hunger. Thomas Lincoln saw his son as a dreamer, someone who wasted time with books when there was work to be done. He would take the books away, tell Abraham to focus on the fields, on the animals, on the things that mattered. But Abraham always found a way back to the words. He would borrow books from neighbors, sometimes walking 20 miles round trip just to get his hands on something new. Once, he borrowed a biography of George Washington and accidentally let it get damaged by rain. He worked 3 days in the neighbor's field to pay for it, then kept the book and read it until he knew Washington's life as well as his own. The stories of great men fascinated him. Men who had risen from nothing. Men who had changed history. Men who had used words and ideas to shape the world. And slowly, quietly, Abraham began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be one of them. But the wilderness was not a place that rewarded dreamers easily. Life on the farm was hard, and it was getting harder. Thomas Lincoln moved the family again, this time to Illinois, when Abraham was 21. They traveled by ox cart across frozen rivers and muddy trails, through snow and bitter cold, until they reached a place near the Sangamon River. There, they built yet another cabin, cleared more land, planted more crops. Abraham worked alongside his father, but his heart was no longer in it. He was tall now, over 6 feet, with long arms and a strength that surprised those who saw him. He could split rails for fences faster than almost anyone, swing an axe with precision, wrestle men twice his weight to the ground. But he did not want to be a farmer. He did not want to spend his life breaking his back for land that would never truly be his. He wanted something more. Something he could not yet name, but felt deep in his bones. When the work was done and the new farm was established, Abraham left. He struck out on his own, drifting down the river to New Salem, a small village where he could start fresh. He was 22 years old, with no money, no formal education, and no clear plan. But he had something more valuable than any of those things. He had a mind that never stopped working, a voice that people wanted to hear, and a belief that hard work and honesty could take him anywhere. In New Salem, he worked as a clerk in a general store, where he earned a reputation for fairness and humor. People liked him. They trusted him. He would walk miles to return a few cents to a customer he had accidentally overcharged. He would stay up late to help neighbors with their problems. He told stories that made people laugh until their sides hurt, and he debated politics with a sharpness that left even educated men impressed. It was in New Salem that Abraham Lincoln began to transform from a backwoods laborer into something else. He joined a debating society, where he learned to argue with logic and passion. He ran for the state legislature and lost, but he was not discouraged. He kept reading, kept learning, kept pushing himself forward. He taught himself surveying and worked measuring land across the county. He became the postmaster, a small position that gave him access to every newspaper that came through town. He read them all, absorbing politics, philosophy, and current events like a man starving for knowledge. And then, one winter, he made a decision that would change everything. He borrowed law books from a local attorney and decided to teach himself the law. There was no law school nearby. No mentor to guide him. Just books, and his own relentless determination. He studied by candlelight and firelight, just as he had as a boy. He memorized legal principles, studied famous cases, practiced arguments in his head. And slowly, page by page, Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer. The boy born in a dirt floor cabin, who had lost his mother to the wilderness, who had spent his childhood swinging an axe and plowing fields, was becoming the man who would one day hold the fate of a nation in his hands. But he did not know that yet. All he knew was that he refused to be defined by where he came from. He refused to let poverty or lack of education be the end of his story. And as the fire burned low in his small room in New Salem, and the night stretched long and quiet around him, Abraham Lincoln kept reading. Kept learning. Kept believing that words, and will, could change everything. By 1837, Abraham Lincoln had passed the bar exam and become a licensed attorney. He was 28 years old, still awkward and ungainly, with a voice that could carry across a crowded room but a face that seemed too long, too rough, too marked by hardship. He moved to Springfield, the new capital of Illinois, with everything he owned packed into saddlebags slung over his horse. He had $7 in his pocket. No connections. No family wealth to fall back on. But he had a law license, a sharp mind, and a reputation for honesty that had followed him from New Salem. In Springfield, he would begin the next chapter of his life, one that would lead him from courtrooms to Congress, and eventually, to the White House itself. He partnered with John Todd Stewart, a fellow lawyer who had encouraged him to study law in the first place. Their practice was modest at first, handling land disputes, debts, and small criminal cases. Lincoln would ride the circuit, traveling from town to town with other lawyers and a judge, staying in rough taverns, sleeping in shared rooms, arguing cases in makeshift courtrooms. It was grueling work, but he loved it. He loved the challenge of standing before a jury and making them see things his way. He loved the way words could be wielded like tools, cutting through confusion, building arguments piece by piece until the truth stood clear. And he was good at it. Juries trusted him because he spoke plainly, without pretension or tricks. He told stories that made complex legal ideas simple. He used humor to disarm opponents, then struck with logic so sharp it left no room for doubt. But Lincoln was more than just a lawyer. He was becoming a political figure, someone people turned to when they wanted their voices heard. In 1834, he had been elected to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party, and he served 4 terms, learning the rhythms of political life. He believed in infrastructure, roads, canals, railroads that could connect isolated communities and build economic opportunity. He believed in banks and credit systems that could help ordinary people rise. He believed in education, in the idea that every child, no matter how poor, deserved a chance to learn. These were not radical ideas, but they were forward-thinking, born from his own experience of poverty and the hunger to escape it. And he fought for them with a persistence that earned him respect, even from those who disagreed. In Springfield, Lincoln also began to navigate the complicated world of relationships. He was shy around women, unsure of himself in ways he never was in a courtroom. He courted Mary Owens, a woman he had known in New Salem, but the relationship fizzled, leaving him embarrassed and uncertain. Then he met Mary Todd, a woman from a wealthy Kentucky family who had moved to Springfield to live with her sister. Mary was educated, sharp-tongued, passionate about politics, and utterly unlike anyone Lincoln had known before. She saw something in him that others missed, a greatness waiting to emerge. They were an unlikely pair. She was from privilege, he was from poverty. She was refined and educated, he was rough and self-taught. But they connected over ideas, over ambition, over a shared belief that the world could be changed. Their courtship was turbulent. Lincoln broke off their engagement once, overwhelmed by doubt and fear of marriage. But they found their way back to each other, and in 1842, they married in a small ceremony in her sister's parlor. Mary Todd Lincoln would be his partner for the rest of his life, and theirs was not an easy marriage. She suffered from what we might now recognize as severe depression and anxiety, mood swings that could turn a peaceful day into chaos. Lincoln, too, carried his own darkness. He had bouts of deep melancholy, periods where the weight of life seemed too much to bear. But they loved each other, in their own complicated way, and they shared dreams. They wanted success. They wanted influence. They wanted to matter. Together, they built a home in Springfield, a modest 2-story house on the corner of 8th and Jackson. It was the only home Lincoln would ever own. And it was there, in that house, that their 4 sons would be born, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas. It was there that Lincoln would read law books late into the night, write speeches by lamplight, and slowly, carefully, build the foundation of a political career that would take him far beyond the prairies of Illinois. But life was fragile, even in the quiet safety of Springfield. In 1850, their second son, Eddie, died just before his 4th birthday, likely from tuberculosis. The grief was crushing. Mary fell into a deep depression, barely able to leave her bed. Lincoln mourned in his own silent way, retreating into work, into books, into long walks where he could be alone with his sorrow. The loss changed them both. It reminded them that no matter how much they achieved, no matter how far they climbed, pain was always close. And yet, they carried on. They had to. Because life does not pause for grief. It moves forward, relentless and indifferent, and those who survive must move with it or be left behind. Lincoln returned to his law practice, to his cases and his clients, and he poured himself into the work with a ferocity that kept the darkness at bay. And slowly, the world around him began to change in ways that would demand everything he had to give. By the early 1850s, America was a nation built on contradiction. It spoke of liberty while holding millions in chains. It promised equality while denying it to those whose skin was the wrong color. The question of slavery had simmered beneath the surface of national politics for decades, occasionally boiling over into violence, then being tamped down by compromise and careful words. But the compromises were growing thinner. The words were losing their power. And men like Abraham Lincoln, who had spent years focused on local issues and economic development, were being forced to confront the moral crisis that threatened to tear the country apart. Lincoln had always believed slavery was wrong. He had never owned enslaved people, though many in Illinois did. He had seen the cruelty of it, the way it reduced human beings to property, the way it corrupted both the enslaved and the enslaver. But he was not an abolitionist in the radical sense. He did not call for immediate emancipation. He did not believe, at least not yet, that black Americans and white Americans could live together as equals in society. These were the prejudices of his time, and Lincoln, for all his wisdom, carried them too. But he believed deeply that slavery was morally indefensible, that it contradicted the founding principles of the nation, and that it must not be allowed to spread into new territories. This position, anti-slavery but not abolitionist, was the ground on which he would make his stand. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. It effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had kept a fragile balance between free and slave states. The act was championed by Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, a political powerhouse who believed in popular sovereignty, the idea that local populations should decide such matters for themselves. But to Lincoln, the act was a betrayal. It opened the door for slavery to spread across the continent, to become permanent and unchallengeable. It turned a moral question into a matter of votes and politics. And it stirred something in Lincoln that had been dormant for years. He returned to politics with a clarity of purpose he had not felt before. He began to speak publicly about slavery, not just as a legal issue, but as a moral one. And people listened. His speeches were not fiery or dramatic in the style of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison. They were measured, logical, built on the bedrock of the Declaration of Independence. "All men are created equal," Lincoln would say, quoting the words every American knew by heart. He argued that this was not just a rhetorical flourish. It was a founding principle. It meant something. And if it meant anything, it meant that slavery was incompatible with the American experiment. He did not demand immediate change. He did not call for revolution. But he insisted, over and over, that slavery must not be allowed to expand. That the nation must recommit itself to the idea that freedom was the natural state of humanity, and that bondage was an aberration to be contained and, eventually, eliminated. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat. It was a long-shot campaign. Douglas was famous, powerful, and well-funded. Lincoln was a former one-term congressman, a prairie lawyer with a reputation for honesty but little national recognition. But Lincoln did something bold. He challenged Douglas to a series of debates, 7 in all, held in towns across Illinois. Thousands came to watch. They stood in fields and town squares, listening for hours as the two men argued about slavery, about the future of the country, about what it meant to be American. Douglas was smooth and confident, insisting that each state and territory should decide the slavery question for itself. Lincoln was earnest and relentless, pressing the moral weight of the issue, refusing to let it be dismissed as mere politics. In Freeport, Lincoln asked Douglas a question that would haunt him for the rest of his career. If the people of a territory voted to exclude slavery, could they do so, even if the Supreme Court had ruled in the Dred Scott decision that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories? Douglas answered yes, that popular sovereignty would prevail. It was a politically savvy answer for Illinois voters, but it alienated Southern Democrats who believed slavery must be protected everywhere. Lincoln lost the Senate race. The state legislature, which chose senators at the time, voted for Douglas. But Lincoln had won something more valuable. He had become a national figure. His arguments had been printed in newspapers across the country. His words, clear, moral, unflinching, had reached people who had never heard of him before. And in the debates, he had articulated a vision of America that resonated with a growing number of citizens who believed the nation could not survive half slave and half free. 2 years later, in 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. It was an unlikely choice. He was not the most famous candidate. He was not the most polished. But he was from Illinois, a crucial swing state. He was moderate enough to appeal to conservatives, but firm enough on slavery to satisfy the party's anti-slavery base. And he had something that others lacked, a life story that embodied the American dream. He was the rail splitter, the self-made man, the poor boy who had risen through intelligence and determination. He was proof that in America, anyone could rise. And in a nation fracturing along lines of class, region, and race, that story mattered. The campaign was bitter. The Democratic Party split into Northern and Southern factions. Lincoln's name did not even appear on ballots in most Southern states. There were threats of secession if he won. But on November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He had not won a majority of the popular vote, but he had won the Electoral College decisively. And as the news spread across the nation, the South began to prepare for war. The winter of 1860 was cold in more ways than one. Abraham Lincoln sat in his modest office in Springfield, reading telegrams and letters that arrived by the dozens each day. Some were congratulatory. Others were threats. Southern newspapers called him a tyrant, a black Republican who would destroy their way of life. Governors warned that their states would leave the Union if he took office. Lincoln tried to reassure them. He wrote letters promising he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. He stated clearly that he only sought to prevent its expansion into new territories. But his words fell on deaf ears. The South had made its decision. Before Lincoln even left Illinois, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. One by one, they broke away, forming a new nation they called the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president, Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War. They seized federal forts, arsenals, and customs houses. And they dared Lincoln to stop them. On February 11, 1861, Lincoln stood on the platform of the Great Western Railroad depot in Springfield, preparing to leave for Washington. A crowd had gathered in the cold drizzle to see him off. Mary and the children were already on the train. Friends and neighbors stood quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. Lincoln looked out at them, at the town that had been his home for nearly a quarter century, and spoke from the heart. "My friends," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place, and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when, or whether ever, I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." He asked them to pray for him. And then he boarded the train, and Springfield disappeared behind him. The journey to Washington took 12 days. Lincoln stopped in cities along the way, giving speeches, meeting crowds, trying to project calm and confidence even as the nation crumbled. In Philadelphia, he spoke at Independence Hall, standing near the place where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence," he said. He spoke of equality, of the idea that all men deserved the right to rise, to improve their condition, to be free. And he made a quiet vow. "But if this country cannot be saved without giving up that principle, I would rather be assassinated on this spot than surrender it." The words were prophetic in ways he could not have known. That very night, Lincoln's security team learned of a plot to kill him as his train passed through Baltimore. They smuggled him through the city in the dead of night, disguised and unannounced. The press mocked him for it, calling him a coward. But he arrived in Washington alive. On March 4, 1861, under gray skies and the watchful eyes of sharpshooters positioned on rooftops, Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office. He stood on the steps of the Capitol, its dome still unfinished, a symbol of a nation incomplete. Chief Justice Roger Taney, the same man who had written the Dred Scott decision declaring that black people had no rights a white man was bound to respect, administered the oath. Lincoln placed his hand on a Bible and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Then he delivered his inaugural address, speaking directly to the South. He pleaded with them. He reminded them that they had no reason to fear him, that he had no power or desire to end slavery where it existed. He appealed to their shared history, to the bonds of affection that tied North and South together. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But his words, however sincere, could not undo what had already been set in motion. 5 weeks later, in the early hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Federal garrison in Charleston Harbor. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. The fort's commander, Major Robert Anderson, surrendered, and the Confederate flag was raised over the ruins. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. In response, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, seceded and joined the Confederacy. The nation was now fully divided. Brother against brother. Neighbor against neighbor. A house that could no longer stand. And at the center of it all was Abraham Lincoln, a man who had never been a soldier, who had never led men into battle, now responsible for preserving a union that seemed determined to destroy itself. The early months of the war were chaos. The Union Army was unprepared, poorly trained, and led by cautious generals who seemed more afraid of losing than determined to win. In July, at the Battle of Bull Run, just outside Washington, Union forces were routed by Confederate troops. Soldiers fled in panic back to the Capitol, and the nation realized this would not be a quick or easy war. Lincoln spent sleepless nights in the War Department, reading dispatches, studying maps, trying to understand strategy he had never been taught. He appointed generals and fired them when they failed to act. He visited troops, walked among the wounded, and carried the weight of every casualty report like stones in his pockets. Mary tried to support him, hosting receptions at the White House, playing the role of First Lady even as her own family in Kentucky fought for the Confederacy. But the strain was visible. Lincoln's face grew gaunt. His hair turned grayer. And the war ground on, month after month, with no end in sight. As the war dragged into 1862, the question that haunted Lincoln most was not just how to win, but what winning would mean. At first, his goal had been clear and limited: restore the Union, bring the Southern states back into the fold, return to the way things were. But the way things were had included slavery, and slavery was the reason the war had started in the first place. Northern abolitionists pressed him to make the war about freedom, to declare emancipation and turn the conflict into a moral crusade. But Lincoln hesitated. He knew that such a move could alienate the border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, slave states that had remained loyal to the Union. Lose them, and the war might be lost. He also worried about Northern soldiers who had enlisted to save the Union, not to free enslaved people. Many of them held racist views, and Lincoln feared they would desert if the war's purpose changed. So he waited. He calculated. He searched for the right moment. But the war itself was changing him. He visited hospitals where men lay dying, their bodies torn apart by bullets and cannonballs. He read letters from mothers who had lost sons, from wives who had lost husbands. He met with Frederick Douglass and other black leaders who challenged him to see the moral clarity of the moment. Douglass pushed him hard, arguing that the Union could never win as long as the Confederacy could use enslaved labor to support its war effort, that every day slavery continued was a betrayal of the nation's founding ideals. Lincoln listened. He wrestled with his own beliefs, with his fear of moving too fast, with the crushing responsibility of leading a nation at war. And slowly, he came to a conclusion. Emancipation was not just morally right. It was militarily necessary. It would weaken the South, strengthen the North, and give the war a purpose that transcended politics. It would make the war about something bigger than borders. It would make it about human dignity. In the summer of 1862, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation in secret. He wrote it carefully, knowing every word would be scrutinized, debated, and tested in ways he could not predict. The proclamation would declare that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. It would not apply to the border states or to areas already under Union control, a strategic decision meant to avoid constitutional challenges and keep the border states loyal. It was not the sweeping, universal emancipation that abolitionists wanted, but it was revolutionary nonetheless. Lincoln read the draft to his cabinet in July. Some supported it. Others were skeptical. Secretary of State William Seward advised him to wait for a Union victory before announcing it, so it would not seem like an act of desperation. Lincoln agreed. And so he waited, holding the document close, knowing it would change everything but unsure when the moment would come. That moment arrived on September 17, 1862, at Antietam Creek in Maryland. It was the bloodiest single day in American history. Nearly 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing by the time the sun set over fields soaked in blood. The battle was technically a draw, but Confederate General Robert E. Lee retreated back into Virginia, giving the Union a strategic victory. 5 days later, on September 22, Lincoln gathered his cabinet again and read them the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation. He told them his mind was made up. "I have got you together to hear what I have written down," he said. "I do not wish your advice about the main matter, for that I have determined for myself." He would issue the proclamation, and it would take effect on January 1, 1863. The cabinet signed off. And the next day, newspapers across the nation printed the text. The reaction was immediate and divided. Abolitionists rejoiced. Conservative Democrats raged. Soldiers debated in camp. And in the South, Confederate leaders declared it proof that Lincoln intended to destroy their civilization. But Lincoln did not waver. On New Year's Day, 1863, he signed the final Emancipation Proclamation into law. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pen, not from doubt, but from hours of shaking hands at a public reception earlier that morning. He paused, looked at the document, and said, "I never, in my life, felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." Then he signed his full name, slowly and carefully, so there could be no doubt. "If my name ever goes into history," he said, "it will be for this act." With that signature, the war's purpose transformed. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery. And though the proclamation did not immediately free every enslaved person, its legal authority only extended to areas in rebellion, it sent a message that echoed across the world. The United States was now committed to abolition. And there would be no going back. The war continued, bloodier and more bitter than ever. In July 1863, Union forces won a decisive victory at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, turning back Lee's invasion of the North. Over 50,000 men were casualties in 3 days of fighting. 4 months later, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. He was not the main speaker. That honor went to Edward Everett, a famous orator who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes. But his words, just 272 of them, became the most famous speech in American history. 47 years ago, he began, "Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He spoke of the men who had died on that field, of the unfinished work they had left behind, of the need to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He spoke simply, directly, with no flourish or pretension. And when he finished, the crowd applauded politely, unaware that they had just heard words that would outlive them all. Lincoln sat down, thinking the speech had failed. But he was wrong. Those words would be carved into marble, memorized by schoolchildren, and quoted for generations as the distillation of what America could be. The years of war weighed on Lincoln like chains. By 1864, the conflict had consumed over 500,000 lives, and there seemed no end in sight. Every morning, Lincoln walked to the War Department to read the latest telegrams from the front. Every night, he returned to the White House, his shoulders bent, his face drawn with exhaustion. He slept poorly, often waking in the middle of the night to pace the halls, his mind turning over strategies, losses, and the impossible mathematics of death. Mary worried about him. Their son Willie had died in 1862, likely from typhoid fever, and the grief had shattered her. She held seances in the White House, trying to contact the dead, while Lincoln buried himself in work, as if constant motion could keep sorrow at bay. Their youngest son, Tad, wandered the White House like a little ghost, and Robert, the eldest, was away at Harvard. The family was fracturing under the weight of tragedy, just as the nation was. The war had become a grinding, relentless machine. In the East, General Ulysses S. Grant had taken command of Union forces, and he fought with a brutality that shocked even hardened soldiers. Grant understood that the North had more men, more resources, more industry. He would use that advantage without mercy. At the Battle of the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, Union forces suffered staggering casualties, but Grant kept pushing forward. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he said. Lincoln had finally found a general who would not retreat, who would not hesitate, who would do whatever was necessary to win. But the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of men died in weeks. Hospitals overflowed. Graveyards filled faster than coffins could be made. And Lincoln carried every one of those deaths with him, a silent burden that no one else could share. In the summer of 1864, Lincoln faced the hardest political challenge of his life. He was up for re-election, and the country was weary of war. Democrats nominated General George McClellan, a former Union commander whom Lincoln had fired for being too cautious. McClellan ran on a platform of negotiating peace with the Confederacy, even if it meant allowing slavery to continue. Many Republicans doubted Lincoln could win. Some even tried to replace him at the convention. Lincoln himself believed he would lose. He wrote a memo predicting his defeat and asked his cabinet to sign it, sight unseen, pledging to cooperate with the new administration to save the Union before the inauguration. It was a gesture of humility and patriotism, a willingness to accept defeat if that was what the people wanted. But Lincoln did not give up. He kept working, kept leading, kept believing that if the Union could just hold on a little longer, victory might still be possible. Then, in September, everything changed. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta, a vital Confederate city and railway hub. The news electrified the North. Suddenly, victory seemed possible again. Suddenly, Lincoln's leadership looked not like stubbornness, but like determination. The election was still close, but when the votes were counted in November, Lincoln won decisively. He carried every northern state except New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. Soldiers voted for him overwhelmingly, men who had seen the worst of the war but believed in the cause they were fighting for. Lincoln was relieved but not triumphant. "I am thankful to God for this approval of the people," he said quietly. "But I know that He permits it for some wise purpose of His own." The war would continue. And Lincoln would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman had marched through Georgia and the Carolinas, leaving a path of destruction in his wake. Grant was besieging Richmond, the Confederate capital. Lee's army was starving, outnumbered, and running out of options. But the South fought on, desperate and defiant, unwilling to accept defeat. Lincoln watched from Washington, hopeful but cautious, knowing that the final months of a war are often the bloodiest. He was also thinking beyond the war, to what would come after. How would the South be rebuilt? How would millions of formerly enslaved people be integrated into society? How could the nation heal wounds so deep they seemed beyond repair? These were questions without easy answers, and Lincoln knew that the peace might be harder to win than the war itself. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln stood once again on the steps of the Capitol to deliver his second inaugural address. The dome was finished now, a symbol of a nation still standing despite everything. The crowd was massive, packed into the muddy streets, straining to hear. Rain had fallen that morning, but as Lincoln stepped forward, the clouds parted and sunlight broke through. He spoke not of victory or vengeance, but of reconciliation and humility. He acknowledged that both North and South had prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, and invoked his aid against each other. The prayers of both could not be answered, that of neither has been answered fully, he said. The Almighty has his own purposes. He spoke of the war as a divine punishment for the sin of slavery, a reckoning that both sides had to endure. And then, in words that would echo through history, he called for healing. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. It was a speech of extraordinary grace, delivered by a man who had every reason to be bitter but chose instead to be forgiving. Less than 6 weeks later, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was dead. News spread across the North like wildfire, and cities erupted in celebration. In Washington, crowds gathered outside the White House, cheering and singing. Lincoln appeared at a window and asked the band to play "Dixie," the Confederate anthem. "It is one of the best tunes I have ever heard," he said with a smile. "Our adversaries over the way attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday that we fairly captured it." The crowd laughed and cheered. For a moment, the weight seemed to lift from Lincoln's shoulders. For a moment, he could imagine a future where the nation was whole again, where the work of reconstruction could begin, where peace was not just a dream but a reality. He had done it. Against all odds, he had held the country together. And now, finally, he could rest. But rest would not come easily. In the days following Lee's surrender, Lincoln was consumed with the work of peace. He met with his cabinet to discuss the future of the South. He spoke publicly about his plans for Reconstruction, proposing that some black men, those who were educated or who had served in the Union Army, should be given the right to vote. It was a radical idea for the time, and even many in the North were not ready for it. But Lincoln believed the nation had to move forward, that freedom meant nothing if it did not include political equality. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there were those in both North and South who would resist change at every turn. But he was determined to see it through. He had not fought a war to preserve the Union only to see it rebuilt on the same broken foundations. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln decided to take a rare night off. He and Mary would go to Ford's Theater to see a play called Our American Cousin, a light comedy that promised a few hours of laughter and escape. Mary was pleased. They had not spent much time together in recent months, and she hoped the evening might bring some joy back into their lives. Lincoln was tired, but he agreed. They invited General Grant and his wife to join them, but the Grants declined, citing other commitments. So the Lincolns went with a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. They arrived late, slipping into the presidential box as the play was already underway. The audience noticed and applauded. Lincoln smiled and nodded, then settled into his rocking chair, Mary beside him, her hand in his. The play was funny, and for a little while, Lincoln laughed. He leaned back in his chair, relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. Outside the box, there was no guard. He had wandered off, perhaps to get a drink, perhaps simply careless. The door to the box was unlocked. And in the shadows of the theater, a man named John Wilkes Booth was waiting. Booth was a famous actor, handsome and charismatic, beloved by audiences across the country. But he was also a Confederate sympathizer, a man consumed by hatred for Lincoln and everything he represented. Booth had been planning this for weeks. He had assembled a small group of conspirators, men who shared his rage and his willingness to kill. Their plan was ambitious: assassinate Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward all on the same night, throwing the government into chaos and giving the South one last chance to rise again. Around 10:15 p.m., as the audience roared with laughter at a joke on stage, Booth slipped into the presidential box. He carried a small Derringer pistol and a hunting knife. He moved quietly, carefully, timing his approach with the laughter so no one would hear. He stepped behind Lincoln, raised the pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of the president's head. The sound was sharp but muffled by the laughter. Mary turned and saw Booth. She screamed. Major Rathbone lunged at him, but Booth slashed him with the knife, cutting deep into his arm. Then Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, landing awkwardly and breaking his leg. But he stood, raised his knife, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants, the motto of Virginia. Then he limped across the stage and disappeared into the night, leaving chaos and horror in his wake. Lincoln slumped forward, unconscious. The bullet had entered behind his left ear and lodged in his brain. Doctors rushed to the box, but they knew immediately that the wound was fatal. They carried him across the street to a boarding house, to a small bedroom where they laid him diagonally on a bed that was too short for his long frame. Mary knelt beside him, weeping uncontrollably. Cabinet members arrived, their faces pale with shock. Throughout the night, they kept vigil as Lincoln's breathing grew slower and more labored. His pulse weakened. His body began to shut down. Outside, word spread through the city. Crowds gathered in the streets, silent and stunned, unable to believe what had happened. The president who had saved the Union, who had ended slavery, who had called for mercy and reconciliation, was dying. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaming down his face, and spoke the words that would define the moment. "Now he belongs to the ages," he said. Mary collapsed in grief. The room fell silent. And across the nation, as the news spread by telegraph, people wept in the streets. Church bells tolled. Flags were lowered to half-staff. The man who had led them through the darkest chapter in their history, who had held the country together when it seemed ready to break apart forever, was gone. And in his absence, the enormity of what had been lost began to settle over the nation like a shroud. John Wilkes Booth fled into the Virginia countryside, hiding in barns and safe houses, but his leg wound slowed him down. 12 days later, Union soldiers tracked him to a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia. They surrounded the barn and demanded he surrender. Booth refused. The soldiers set the barn on fire to force him out. In the chaos, a shot rang out. Whether Booth shot himself or a soldier shot him remains unclear, and Booth fell, paralyzed. He was dragged from the burning barn, his body broken, and died hours later, whispering, "Useless, useless." His co-conspirators were hunted down, tried, and hanged. But their crime could not be undone. Abraham Lincoln was dead, and with him died the best hope for a just and merciful reconstruction of the South. The nation mourned in a way it had never mourned before. Lincoln's body was prepared for burial, dressed in the black suit he had worn to his second inauguration, his face composed but marked by the years of war and sorrow. On April 19, a funeral was held in the East Room of the White House. 600 people attended, cabinet members, generals, diplomats, congressmen, all dressed in black, their faces drawn with grief. Mary was too distraught to attend. She remained upstairs in her room, overcome by a sorrow so deep it would never fully release her. The service was somber, filled with hymns and prayers, but the silence between the words felt heavier than anything spoken. Outside, thousands stood in the rain, unable to get inside but unwilling to leave, as if their presence alone could somehow honor the man they had lost. After the service, Lincoln's body was placed in a special funeral train, draped in black crepe and adorned with photographs of the president. The train would carry him home to Springfield, retracing the route he had taken to Washington 4 years earlier, but this time in reverse, and in silence. The journey took 2 weeks, stopping in cities along the way, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, so that people could pay their respects. At each stop, the casket was removed and displayed in a public building, and tens of thousands lined up to file past, some waiting for hours in the cold and rain just to see his face one last time. They came from every walk of life, soldiers in uniform, freedmen who had been enslaved just months before, mothers holding their children, old men who had voted for him and old men who had not. They came because they understood, perhaps for the first time, what he had meant to them. In New York, over 500,000 people lined the streets as the funeral procession passed. Buildings were draped in black bunting. Bells tolled without ceasing. In Philadelphia, the casket was displayed in Independence Hall, the very place where Lincoln had spoken 4 years earlier about the sanctity of the Declaration of Independence. Now he lay there, silent and still, beneath the same roof where the founders had declared that all men are created equal. It felt fitting, and tragic, and unbearably sad. Everywhere the train went, the crowds were immense and silent, as if the entire nation had paused to grieve. They sang hymns. They wept openly. They held up signs that read, "He lives in our hearts," and, "Father Abraham, rest in peace." And on the train, inside a car lit by candles, Lincoln's coffin rested alongside a smaller one, that of his son Willie, whose body had been exhumed so father and son could be buried together. On May 3rd, the train arrived in Springfield. The town where Lincoln had lived as a young lawyer, where he had raised his family, where he had dreamed of becoming something more, now it prepared to lay him to rest. The casket was taken to the State House, where it lay in state for a final viewing. Over 75,000 people came, more than twice the population of the entire city. They came from neighboring towns and distant farms, traveling by wagon and on foot, determined to see him one last time. Then, on May 4th, a funeral procession moved slowly through the streets toward Oak Ridge Cemetery, just outside town. A military band played dirges. A riderless horse, boots reversed in the stirrups, followed the hearse. Thousands walked behind in silence. And at the cemetery, beneath a temporary vault, Abraham Lincoln was finally laid to rest. The man who had saved the Union, who had freed the enslaved, who had called for mercy in the face of hatred, was gone. But his work remained. The nation he left behind was transformed. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States, was ratified in December 1865, 8 months after his death. It was the culmination of everything Lincoln had fought for, the legal end to an institution that had poisoned the nation since its founding. But the struggle for equality was far from over. Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's assassination, was a Southern Democrat with little sympathy for the rights of black Americans. He opposed nearly every measure designed to protect freedmen, vetoed bills that would have provided them with land and education, and sought to restore white supremacy in the South as quickly as possible. Radical Republicans in Congress fought back, passing the 14th and 15th Amendments to guarantee citizenship and voting rights, but the battle was long and bitter. And in the South, white supremacists formed groups like the Ku Klux Klan, using terror and violence to suppress black political power and restore the old order under a new name. Lincoln would have fought against this. He would have used his political skill, his moral authority, his ability to persuade and inspire, to push for a reconstruction that was just and inclusive. But he was not there. And without him, the promise of equality that he had articulated so powerfully remained unfulfilled. The freedmen were legally free, but economically dependent, politically vulnerable, and often in mortal danger. The South was brought back into the Union, but not healed. The nation was preserved, but not reconciled. And the work that Lincoln had called for in his second inaugural, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for those who had borne the battle, was left incomplete, a task that would stretch across generations and remains unfinished even now. In the years that followed, Lincoln's memory grew into something larger than life. He became a symbol, a martyr, a myth. Statues were erected in his honor. His face was carved into mountainsides. His words were taught in schoolrooms and quoted in speeches. He became Father Abraham, the great emancipator, the savior of the Union. And in many ways, he deserved these titles. He had done what seemed impossible, held a fracturing nation together through sheer force of will and wisdom. He had turned a war to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery. He had articulated a vision of America that was rooted in equality and human dignity. But the mythology sometimes obscured the man. It made him seem superhuman, distant, untouchable. And in doing so, it lost something essential about who he really was. Abraham Lincoln was not perfect. He held prejudices common to his time. He did not initially believe in full equality between black and white Americans. He prioritized political pragmatism over moral absolutes, at least until the war forced his hand. He could be ruthless when necessary, suspending habeas corpus, arresting dissenters, pushing constitutional boundaries to keep the Union intact. He was moody, prone to deep depression, often distant even from those closest to him. He struggled in his marriage. He lost children and carried that grief like a shadow. He made mistakes, miscalculated, and doubted himself more than history often remembers. But his greatness lay not in being flawless, but in being capable of growth. He listened. He learned. He changed his mind when evidence demanded it. And he never stopped believing that the nation could be better than it was, that the ideals and the Declaration of Independence were worth fighting for, even dying for. His speeches remain some of the most powerful in the English language. The Gettysburg Address, just 272 words, redefined the purpose of the Civil War and set forth a vision of government, of the people, by the people, for the people, that has inspired democratic movements around the world. His second inaugural address, with its call for malice toward none and charity for all, offered a blueprint for reconciliation that the nation desperately needed but failed to fully embrace. His debates with Stephen Douglas laid bare the moral contradictions of slavery and forced Americans to confront what their nation stood for. And his simple, plain-spoken letters, to grieving mothers, to soldiers, to citizens asking for guidance, revealed a man of profound empathy and humility. He wrote to Mrs. Bixby, a woman who had supposedly lost 5 sons in the war, words that still break hearts today. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming, he wrote. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. Whether or not Mrs. Bixby actually lost 5 sons, historians later discovered the truth was more complicated, the sentiment was real, and it captured Lincoln's deep sense of the human cost of war. After his death, Mary Todd Lincoln's life unraveled completely. She was consumed by grief, mental illness, and paranoia. She believed she was being watched, that people were trying to steal from her. She spent money recklessly, fell into debt, and alienated friends and family. In 1875, her surviving son, Robert, had her committed to an insane asylum, though she was released a few months later. She spent her final years in isolation, traveling between relatives' homes, never finding peace. She died in 1882, at the age of 63, in the same Springfield house where she and Abraham had raised their children. She was buried beside him in Oak Ridge Cemetery, reunited at last but only in death. Their story is a reminder that even the greatest lives are touched by tragedy, that public greatness does not shield anyone from private pain. Lincoln's legacy lived on in ways both inspiring and incomplete. The Republican Party he helped build became the Party of Reconstruction, fighting to secure rights for Black Americans, at least for a time. But by the 1870s, the North grew weary of the fight. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Jim Crow laws were enacted, stripping Black Americans of the rights they had briefly held. Segregation became law. Violence became routine. And for nearly a century, the promise of equality that Lincoln had articulated remained a distant dream. It would take the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, led by people like Martin Luther King Jr., who invoked Lincoln's words and his memory, to begin to fulfill that promise. King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech, calling America to live up to the ideals Lincoln had died for. 50 years ago, King began, deliberately echoing the Gettysburg Address, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He reminded the nation that the work was not finished, that freedom and equality were still being denied. And in doing so, he carried Lincoln's torch forward. Today, Lincoln remains one of the most studied, debated, and revered figures in American history. Scholars argue about his motivations, his beliefs, his strategies. Some see him as a cautious pragmatist who did the minimum necessary to end slavery. Others see him as a moral visionary who pushed the nation toward justice. Both perspectives hold truth. Lincoln was complicated, as all real people are. But what cannot be denied is that he changed the course of history. He held the nation together when it was on the brink of collapse. He ended an institution that had existed for centuries. He redefined what America could be. And he did it all while carrying a burden of grief, doubt, and responsibility that would have crushed most men. He once said, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." It was a statement of humility, but also of recognition that history is shaped by forces beyond any one person. Yet in the midst of those uncontrollable events, Lincoln made choices that mattered. He chose to fight for the Union. He chose to free the enslaved. He chose mercy over vengeance. And those choices echo still. As the night deepens and these words settle into the quiet, let them carry with them a simple truth. Abraham Lincoln was a man born into nothing who became everything his nation needed. He was not a perfect man, but he was a good one. He was not without flaws, but he was without malice. He believed that America was an idea worth preserving, that equality was a principle worth dying for, and that even in the darkest hours, hope could survive if people chose to believe in it. His life reminds us that greatness is not born, it is built, word by word, choice by choice, in the face of impossible odds. And his death reminds us that even the best among us are fragile, mortal, and gone too soon. But the words remain. The ideas remain. And as long as they do, Abraham Lincoln will never truly be gone. He belongs, as Stanton said, to the ages. And to us. Now and always. Rest well.